A mentally impaired child was diagnosed as being 8 months pregnant. But when the doctors revealed the truth, the family was plunged into an unimaginable nightmare. Selena's eyes fluttered open, the hazy fog of anesthesia slowly lifting. The room was sterile and cold, the low hum of machines filling the silence. She blinked against the sharp light overhead, disoriented, as the events of the last few hours began to settle in her mind. The labor had been long, grueling. 2 lives had come into the world, her babies, her long-awaited twins. She remembered Alex by her side, his hand gripping hers tightly, the tension in his face palpable, even as he whispered reassurances in her ear. She shifted, trying to sit up, but the weight of exhaustion pulled her back down. A nurse entered quietly, her footsteps soft against the tiled floor. Selena's first instinct was to ask for her babies, to hold them in her arms, but the words caught in her throat. The nurse's face was too calm, too controlled. The anxiety she had felt moments ago was growing into something darker, more insidious. "Where are they?" Selena's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. The nurse avoided her gaze as she adjusted the IV drip. "The doctor will be in shortly, Mrs. Reyes. Just rest for now." Rest? How could she rest when her heart was thundering in her chest? She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But just as the panic rose, the door swung open, and in walked Alex, followed by 2 doctors, their faces grim. Alex's eyes met hers, and her breath caught. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His skin pale, his eyes shadowed with a weight she didn't understand. He sat down beside her, reaching for her hand. But there was something in his touch that wasn't right. Something distant. "Alex." Her voice trembled now. "What's wrong? Where are the babies?" He squeezed her hand, but the words didn't come from him. One of the doctors, a tall man with graying hair and a solemn expression, stepped forward. "Selena," the doctor began gently, "your babies, they're in the NICU. They were born conjoined at the head." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind scrambled to process what he had just said. Conjoined? At the head? Her babies? Her perfect, beautiful twins? No. She shook her head, her voice thick with disbelief. "No, that's not possible." Alex's grip tightened on her hand, and she could see the pain in his eyes. He had known. He had known this whole time, and he hadn't told her. "I'm sorry, Selena," the doctor continued, his voice calm but filled with compassion. "It's a rare condition, very rare, but the babies are stable for now." The doctor hesitated, a shadow passing over his face. Selena's heart began to race, dread creeping up her spine. "But," Selena's voice barely escaped her throat. "But what?" He took a breath, his gaze serious. "Their brains share vital blood vessels. If we don't operate soon, they will both die. The pressure on their brain tissue will increase rapidly. They are already struggling." The room spun as Selena struggled to take in the gravity of the situation. The doctor's words were like icy daggers stabbing at her heart. "Operate, or they will die." It was impossible. This couldn't be happening. "We've done some tests," the doctor continued, "and we believe the surgery can give them a chance. But there are no guarantees. The procedure is incredibly risky. You must understand that." Selena felt Alex's hand tremble against hers. He had known, and he hadn't told her because how could anyone possibly prepare for something like this? "I want to see them," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "I need to see them." The doctor nodded and motioned for the nurse who helped Selena out of bed. Her body felt weak, but her will was stronger than the pain. She had to see her children. When they entered the NICU, Selena's breath caught in her throat. There, in a crib surrounded by blinking machines and quiet beeping monitors, lay her 2 babies, her Elise and Daniel. Their small bodies, perfect in every way, were connected by the head. A soft blanket was draped over them, but even from the distance she could see the strain on their tiny forms. Their heads pressed against each other, their skins slightly bruised from the pressure. And then, as if sensing her presence, one of the babies, Elise, the doctor told her, twitched. The movement caused the other, little Daniel, to stir. And suddenly, they both began to wriggle, their arms flailing, their tiny faces scrunching in discomfort. The more they moved, the more agitated they became, their small cries filling the room, sharp and distressed. They were in pain, their conjoined heads making every twitch and squirm an act of struggle. Selena's heart shattered. She moved closer, her trembling hand reaching out toward them, tears streaming down her face. They were so fragile, so helpless, and yet Even in their discomfort, they were beautiful. But seeing them like this, fighting against their own bodies, it was unbearable. "You see," the doctor said softly, standing behind her, "their movements are causing pressure to build on their shared blood vessels. If we don't perform the surgery, this pressure will damage their brain tissue irreparably. We must act quickly, Selena. Every moment we delay puts their lives in greater danger." Selena felt as though the world was closing in around her. Her babies, her precious children, were suffering. They needed her to make a decision. She glanced at Alex, her heart aching at the helplessness in his eyes. There was no choice. She knew that now. She stepped back, turning to face the doctor. Her voice, though shaky, was resolute. "Do the surgery. Do it as soon as you can. They can't live like this. I won't let them die." Alex, standing beside her, nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice raw with emotion. The doctor nodded solemnly. "We'll begin preparations immediately. Time is critical, but we'll do everything we can to give them a chance." As the doctor left the room, Selena stood frozen, watching as her babies, still squirming in their crib, began to quiet down. The machines continued their soft, rhythmic beeping, but the sound seemed distant, hollow. All she could hear was the echo of her own thoughts: surgery or death. She looked at her husband, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision they'd just made. She wiped at her eyes, struggling to keep herself composed. "I don't know if I can do this, Alex." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and for a moment they stood there, two people who had been thrown into an unimaginable reality, clinging to each other in the face of the unknown. "We'll get through this," he murmured, though his voice cracked. "Together." Selena closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She didn't know how they would, but somehow they had to. They had no other choice. The day had arrived. Selena had been dreading it, counting down the hours, wishing time would stop altogether. But now, sitting in the stark white waiting room of the hospital, she realized that no amount of fear could slow the inevitable. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, the low hum of hospital machines, a constant reminder of the battle taking place just beyond the doors. Her heart raced in sync with the steady ticking of the wall clock, each second dragging on for what felt like a lifetime. Alex sat beside her, his hands clenched tightly together, knuckles pale. He hadn't spoken much that morning, neither of them had. There wasn't much left to say. They had done all they could, trusted the best doctors, made the impossible decision, and now they waited. The door to the operating room opened briefly, and Selena's breath caught in her throat. But it was only a nurse passing through. No news yet, no relief. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves, but the tight knot in her chest wouldn't loosen. The surgery had started at dawn, the first beams of sunlight just beginning to break through the morning clouds. Now hours had passed, and still there was no word. How could it take this long? The thought plagued her, gnawing at her with relentless force. Alex shifted in his seat, glancing at her with eyes that held a mixture of hope and fear. "They'll be okay," he whispered, though his voice trembled. He was trying to be strong for her, for their children. But Selena could see the doubt in his face, the same doubt that haunted her every waking moment. "They have to be," she replied, though the words felt hollow. She clenched her fists in her lap, nails digging into her palms, grounding herself in the sharp sting. It was the only thing that felt real right now, this waiting, this endless torment of not knowing. Minutes bled into hours, and Selena lost track of time. She tried to distract herself, thinking of Elise's tiny fingers, of little Alex's soft coos, of what it would be like to finally hold them separately, two perfect little souls. That was the dream she clung to, the dream that had kept her going through the sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of decisions no parent should have to make. Then, suddenly, the door opened again. This time, it was the doctor. His face was calm, too calm, and that terrified Selena more than anything. She shot up from her seat, Alex right behind her. The world felt like it had shrunk to this one moment, to the expression on the doctor's face. "We've successfully completed the surgery," the doctor began, his voice steady but low. "Your children, they've been separated." Selena's knees almost buckled. Relief washed over her in a tidal wave, and she gripped Alex's arm for support. For the briefest moment, there was nothing but pure, unfiltered joy. They had done it. their babies were safe. But then she saw the doctor's eyes shift, the way he hesitated, as though weighing his next words carefully. A chill ran down her spine. There were complications, he continued, his voice softening. Elise has suffered significant trauma to her brain during the procedure. Selina felt the floor drop out from beneath her. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor sighed, glancing between the two of them, his expression filled with the kind of sorrow only a man who delivers this kind of news daily could carry. She's alive, but the damage is severe. Elise won't develop like a typical child. The trauma has affected her cognitive abilities. It's likely that she will have significant intellectual disabilities. Selina's world shattered. The words hit her like physical blows, each one sinking deeper, cutting away at her hopes, her dreams for her daughter. She had been prepared for risks, had known that this surgery was dangerous, but nothing could have prepared her for this. She won't be normal, Alex asked, his voice tight, almost strangled. The doctor shook his head gently. No, Elise will need special care. It's hard to say exactly what her limitations will be, but her brain won't function as we had hoped. Selina's legs finally gave out, and she sank into the chair behind her, tears welling in her eyes. All the hope she had carried into this day crumbled around her. But she's alive, she managed to choke out. Yes, she's alive, the doctor assured her. She's stable and will continue to monitor her closely. Alive, the word echoed in Selina's mind. She should have been grateful. She was grateful. But the future she had envisioned for her daughter was gone, replaced by something she hadn't prepared for, something she didn't know how to handle. Beside her, Alex knelt down, taking her hands in his. We'll get through this, he whispered, though his own tears glistened in his eyes. She's here with us. That's what matters. Selina nodded, though the pain was unbearable. She couldn't lose sight of that. Not now. Elise was alive. She would be with them, and they would love her no matter what. But deep down, Selina grieved for the life her daughter would never have, for the milestones she would never reach. And, Alex? She asked, her voice trembling. Our son, he's doing well, the doctor said. No complications, he'll recover fully. Selina's heart twisted in conflicting emotions, relief and guilt all at once. The doctor stood, offering a final nod before slipping away, leaving them alone in their grief and fragile hope. Selina leaned into Alex, her body racked with silent sobs. Time moved forward with a steady, inevitable pace, though for Selina, it often felt as if the days passed too quickly and too slowly all at once. It had been nearly 5 years since that fateful surgery, and though the ache of what was lost still lingered in the corners of her heart, life pressed on. Elise and Daniel had grown, two sides of the same coin, but with vastly different fates. Elise, with her delicate frame and soft features, was the gentler of the two. Her dark eyes always seemed to be searching, observing in a quiet, contemplative way. But as the years passed, it became impossible to ignore how far behind she lagged compared to other children her age. While Daniel was quick to learn, speaking in full sentences by his 3rd birthday, Elise remained mostly silent. Her words came slowly, cautiously, as though she had to grasp for each one, pulling it from somewhere deep inside her. Other children babbled easily, laughed loudly, and ran without thought. Elise, in contrast, preferred the quiet. She would sit for hours with her crayons or colored pencils, lost in her own little world, drawing with a level of concentration that astounded Selina. Her small hands would glide over the paper, carefully choosing colors, creating shapes that were simple, but filled with a depth that belied her young age. Sometimes Selina would watch her from the kitchen, her heart torn between pride and sorrow. Elise's drawings were her voice more so than her halting speech. There was something almost mystical about the way she communicated through them, as though the pictures held the thoughts and emotions she couldn't otherwise express. One day, Selina found a sketch of the family, herself, Alex, and their 2 children. The lines were clean, the colors warm, but what caught Selina's attention was how Elise had drawn herself. She was smaller, separate, standing slightly apart from the others. It broke Selina's heart in a way she hadn't expected. Daniel, in contrast, was the definition of a quick learner. By the time he was 5, he was already reading simple books and asking questions that seemed far too mature for his age. His bright eyes sparkled with curiosity, and he took to school like a fish to water, soaking up knowledge with an eagerness that sometimes overwhelmed even his teachers. Selena and her husband often marveled at how easily Daniel navigated the world, as though everything came naturally to him. But while Daniel thrived academically, his attention was never far from his sister. Selena had noticed it early on, how protective he was of Elise. Despite being younger by just a few minutes, Daniel acted like the older sibling, always watching out for her. When they played, it was Daniel who would wait patiently for Elise to finish her sentences, never rushing her, never making her feel small. One day, when they were at the park, Selena watched as Daniel guided Elise towards the swings. A group of children nearby was playing a loud, boisterous game of tag, their laughter filling the air. Elise watched them, her gaze curious but cautious, staying close to Daniel as they approached the swings. "She never plays with them," Selena said quietly, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Alex was beside her, leaning against the park bench, his eyes following the children as well. "She doesn't want to," he replied, his tone matter of fact. "It's too fast for her." Selena sighed, her heart heavy. "But doesn't she feel left out?" Alex glanced at her, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "No, Mom. She doesn't like their games. She likes drawing. That's enough for her." And it was true. While other children ran and screamed, Elise was content sitting at the base of a tree, a sketch pad in her lap, her little hands moving carefully, creating her world with lines and colors. But not everyone understood Elise like Daniel did. The first day of school had been particularly hard. Selena had dressed them both in matching outfits, Elise in a light blue dress with small flowers, and Daniel in a button-down shirt of the same shade. She had hoped the sense of unity would comfort Elise, but the day had ended in tears. Other children had noticed quickly that Elise wasn't like them. Her halting speech, the way she fumbled with simple tasks, how she seemed lost in her own world. They made her an easy target. Daniel, ever the protective brother, had stormed home that day, furious with the kids who had teased her. They called her names. "Mom," he had said, his small fists clenched in anger. "They said she's weird." Selena had knelt down, her hands gently resting on his shoulders. "Elise is special," she had whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She just sees the world differently. You have to help them understand that." And Daniel had. Every day since, he had become his sister's silent guardian. When the other kids teased Elise for the way she spoke, Daniel would step in, his young voice firm with confidence. "She's got more talent in her pinky than all of you put together," he would say, pulling out one of her drawings from his backpack, showing it to anyone who would listen. And slowly, the teasing stopped. Some of the other children even started asking to see her drawings. And though Elise remained shy, she seemed to take comfort in knowing Daniel was there, always ready to defend her, to show the world the beauty she held inside. At night, when the house was quiet, Selena would sometimes walk into their shared room to find Elise and Daniel together, side by side in their small beds. Daniel would often have one of Elise's sketches pinned to the wall above his headboard, a reminder that while his sister might not see the world the way he did, she was a part of him, and he was a part of her. They were different, but together they were whole. It began quietly, as these things often do. Whispers, subtle at first, barely noticeable, weaving through the small town like a slow-moving fog. Selena didn't hear them at first, or perhaps she didn't want to. Life had become a delicate balancing act between caring for Elise, who was now 10, and still struggling to communicate in full sentences, and supporting Daniel, who was thriving in school and excelling in nearly everything he tried. Elise's gentle nature and her remarkable art had become the center of their world, and for a while that had been enough. But then Elise's belly started to grow. At first, Selena dismissed it as nothing more than a childhood phase, a bit of weight gain during the lazy summer days when the heat kept Elise indoors, bent over her sketch pad, drawing with her usual quiet intensity. But as the weeks passed, the slight roundness became impossible to ignore. Her once delicate frame was now marked by a swollen abdomen that grew unnaturally fast, too fast for Selena to explain away. Concern turned into fear, and fear turned into dread. Then came the whispers. It was at the grocery store where Selena first felt it. She caught the glances before the words. eyes darting toward her, quickly looking away. A soft murmur here, a smirk there. She tried to ignore it, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a carton of milk, but the voice of an elderly woman near the produce section was impossible to miss. "Poor child, you've heard the rumors, haven't you?" "About Alex?" "The father," came the hushed reply. Selina's blood ran cold. She stood frozen in place, her pulse quickening, the edges of her vision blurring. "They can't be talking about us," she thought desperately. "They can't possibly believe." But the words were clear, sharp as broken glass, cutting through the mundane noise of the store. "They say he's the reason for that poor girl's belly," the woman continued, her voice low but vicious. "It's a shame, really. He always seemed so respectable." The milk slipped from Selina's hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud, splattering her shoes and the ground beneath her. But she barely noticed. All she could hear were the whispers, the accusations, the cruel, baseless rumors that Alex, her loving husband, was somehow responsible for the changes in Elise's body. It was an absurd, sickening lie. And yet here it was being spoken aloud in her own town, a town that had always known her family. She fled the store, leaving the spilled milk behind, her mind racing with disbelief and anger. Back at home, she found Alex in the kitchen, quietly preparing dinner. He looked up as she entered, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Selina?" he asked, concern etched across his face. She stood there, hands trembling, not knowing how to tell him what she had heard. They're talking about you, Alex. About us. About Elise." Alex's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Talking about what?" "They think," her voice broke, the words catching in her throat, "they think you did this to her, that you hurt her." For a moment the air seemed to leave the room. Alex stood still, his face pale with shock. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They think her belly. They think it's because of you," Selina choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I heard them, Alex. At the store. They're saying you." She couldn't finish the sentence, the weight of it too unbearable. Alex's eyes darkened with disbelief and anger. "That's impossible," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "How could they? How could anyone say something so horrible?" But the damage was already done. The rumors had taken root, spreading like wildfire through the town. Wherever Selina and Alex went, there were eyes watching them, whispers that followed them down the streets behind closed doors. It didn't matter that they knew the truth, that Alex had done nothing but love and care for his daughter, that their family was built on love and sacrifice. The town had made up its mind, and the accusations lingered like a stain that couldn't be washed away. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the rumors pressed down on them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Selina stopped going into town as often, afraid of what she might hear next. Alex became more withdrawn, the pain of the accusations gnawing at him like a poison. But the worst of it all was Elise. She didn't understand the whispers or the cruel glances, but she could sense the tension in the air, the way her parents seemed on edge. Her belly continued to grow, and with it, the fear that something was terribly wrong. "We need to take her to the doctor," Alex said one evening, his voice resolute. "We can't keep waiting, hoping this will go away on its own." Selina nodded, her face pale with worry. The next day they made the appointment. The hours dragged on with a painful slowness, the sterile hospital walls suffocating Selina as she sat next to Alex in the waiting room. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the hall, accompanied by the occasional murmur of nurses passing by. They had already endured the worst of this room's suffocating silence during the surgery years ago. And yet here they were again, on the precipice of another nightmare. Elise sat quietly between them, her small hands gripping her sketch pad. The simple comfort of her drawings seemed to shield her from the weight pressing down on her parents. Selina reached over, brushing a strand of Elise's hair behind her ear, her touch gentle but filled with a mother's desperate hope. The little girl looked up and smiled, but the smile was thin, worn, much like Selina's heart. Finally, the door opened and the doctor stepped in. His face was calm, composed, but behind that professionalism, Selina could sense the gravity of what was about to be said. She squeezed Alex's hand once more, her pulse quickening as the doctor took his seat. "We've run all the necessary tests," the doctor began, folding his hands in his lap, his gaze steady but soft. "The swelling in Elise's abdomen is not what we initially feared. It's not related to any pregnancy or anything inappropriate." He paused, giving them a moment to absorb that relief. But Selina couldn't relax. She could feel the butt coming. The heavy air between them was thick with it. However, the doctor continued, "We've discovered that the cause of her condition is related to complications from the surgery she underwent as a baby. Specifically, it's her liver." Selina's breath caught in her throat. Alex's hand tightened in hers, and she felt him stiffen beside her. The doctor went on, explaining in detail, but the words felt distant, blurred by the roaring sound of fear in Selina's ears. Her liver has been growing abnormally due to scar tissue and the way her body healed after the separation. It's developed into a serious condition, one that's now causing her abdomen to swell. Selina swallowed hard, her mouth dry. The relief she had felt just moments ago evaporated. There was no sinister abuse, but this was its own kind of terror. Her daughter's body was turning against itself, and it was because of a decision they had made all those years ago. The surgery that had saved Elise's life was now threatening it again. The doctor continued, his voice calm but grave. "This condition has reached a point where it's becoming life-threatening. Elise will need a liver transplant, and soon. Without it, well, we're running out of time." A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped Selina's lips. She had prepared herself for bad news, but this, another surgery, another fight for survival. The weight of it crushed her chest. Alex, stoic as ever, leaned forward. His voice, though controlled, was strained with the kind of helplessness no father ever wanted to feel. "A transplant," he repeated slowly. "How soon are we talking?" "We're looking at weeks, not months," the doctor replied gently. "The good news is that we've already checked for compatibility within the family." "Alex," he turned to him directly, "you're a match." The room seemed to tilt, the floor shifting beneath them. Selina glanced at Alex, her heart pounding in her chest. He was already nodding, his jaw set with the kind of determination she had come to know so well. Of course he would do it. He didn't need to say it. She knew he would walk through fire if it meant saving their daughter. "I'll do it," Alex said simply. His voice didn't waver, though Selina could see the fear lurking behind his steady gaze. "Whatever it takes." The doctor nodded, his expression serious but approving. "It's not without risk. Donating a portion of the liver is a major surgery, and recovery can be difficult. But given the circumstances, it's our best option to save Elise's life." Selina's breath trembled in her chest. The room felt cold, sterile, and unforgiving. She tried to process everything the doctor was saying, but all she could think about was the sight of Elise's small body lying in that hospital bed again, tubes and machines surrounding her. She had fought so hard as a baby, and now here she was, back in the same battle. But this time the stakes felt even higher. Tears blurred Selina's vision as she looked at Alex, her heart swelling with both love and fear. She had always known he was strong, but this was a different kind of strength, the kind that made her both proud and terrified. Elise, oblivious to the full weight of the conversation, remained focused on her sketchpad. Her concentration was serene, a quiet world all her own, even as her parents' world threatened to fall apart once again. The doctor spoke again, breaking the silence. "We'll schedule the surgery as soon as possible." They left the hospital in silence, the cool evening air brushing against their skin as they walked to the car. Elise trotted alongside them, holding her sketchpad like it was a lifeline, her smile small and unaware. Selina tried to smile back, but her heart was heavy. When they arrived home, Selina finally let the tears come. She curled up next to Alex on the couch, his arms around her, holding her as she cried into his chest. "It's not fair," she whispered. "She's just a child. She's been through so much already." "I know," Alex replied, his voice low and full of pain. "But we'll get through this. We have to." And there it was again, the thin, fragile thread of hope. Selina held on to it as tightly as she could, praying it would be strong enough to carry them through. The sterile scent of the hospital hit Alex's senses the moment he stepped into the surgical ward. The walls, so white they almost glowed, seemed to press in on him, amplifying the tension already tightening in his chest. But today it wasn't just his fear for Elise that weighed on him. It was the knowledge that Selina, too, was lying on an operating table just a few doors away. The two people he loved most were about to undergo the most dangerous procedures of their lives, and he was utterly powerless to help either of them. Elise lay in her hospital bed, looking so small under the white sheets. Her swollen abdomen, the sign of battle they were about to fight, rose and fell with her shallow breaths. Alex stood beside her, his hand in hers, squeezing gently, as if to ground both of them in this moment. It had been her mother's decision, a decision Selena made without hesitation. She had chosen to donate part of her liver to save her daughter's life. Alex knew that Selena was strong, but as the time for surgery neared, the reality of what could happen overwhelmed him. The doctors had explained everything. The tumor in Elise's liver was growing fast, too fast for them to wait any longer. A transplant was the only option, and Selena, having the best match, had volunteered. But now, as Alex stood in the hospital room waiting for the surgery to begin, the fear that gripped him was like nothing he had ever felt. His wife and daughter were both on the line, and he could do nothing but stand here, watching, waiting. "Daddy?" Elise's voice was soft, her eyes wide as they looked up at him. "Is Mommy okay?" Alex swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. He forced a smile, though his heart was heavy. "She's going to be fine, sweetheart. Just like you. You're both strong." Elise blinked slowly, her little hand tightening in his. "I'm scared." Alex knelt down beside her, brushing a lock of hair away from her forehead. "I know, baby, I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But we're going to get through this, I promise." At that moment, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his usual youthful energy dimmed by the gravity of the situation. He walked over to Elise's bed and took her other hand, his expression far too serious for a boy his age. "You're going to be okay, Elise," Daniel whispered, his voice steady despite the fear Alex could see lurking behind his eyes. "I'm right here with you. I'm not leaving." Alex's throat tightened at the sight of his son standing beside his sister, so protective, so determined. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're a good brother," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Daniel nodded, though he didn't take his eyes off Elise. "She's my sister," he said simply. "I have to be." The nurses arrived then, gently unhooking Elise's IV and preparing her to be taken to the operating room. Daniel held onto her hand until the very last moment, his fingers reluctant to let go. As the doors to the operating room closed behind her, Alex felt the overwhelming weight of helplessness pressed down on him. Selena was already inside another operating room, undergoing her own surgery to donate a part of her liver. Both his wife and daughter were now in the hands of surgeons, and Alex was left in a limbo of waiting, unable to be there for either of them. The minutes dragged into hours, each one feeling like a lifetime. Alex sat alone in the sterile waiting room, his head resting in his hands. He had no one to turn to for comfort. Selena was in surgery, and Elise was too. The weight of their absence pressed down on him, suffocating. His mind kept wandering to Selena, imagining her on the operating table, the doctors working frantically to remove a portion of her liver. He had to trust that they knew what they were doing. But how could he not worry? How could he not fear losing her? Every time a nurse walked past, his head jerked up, hoping for news, but each time they passed by without stopping. There was no update, no word, and the waiting, this unbearable waiting, felt like torture. He thought about Selena's courage, how she had looked at him that morning, her eyes filled with resolve. "I'll do it," she had said when the doctor asked if she understood the risks. He had tried to talk her out of it, had begged her to consider waiting for another donor, but she had been firm. "I'm her mother, Alex," she had whispered, her voice soft but unyielding. "If there's even a chance that I can save her, I'll do whatever it takes." Now, as Alex sat in the cold waiting room, that memory was both a source of pride and of fear. Selena was the strongest person he knew, but even she wasn't invincible. What if something went wrong? What if neither of them came out of this? The thought was too terrible to bear, and he pushed it down, forcing himself to stay calm, to stay hopeful. The hours ticked by, and each second stretched on, filled with a tension that was almost unbearable. Alex's hands were clammy, his legs restless as he paced the waiting room, unable to sit still any longer. The idea that both his wife and daughter were lying on operating tables, their lives hanging in the balance, was almost too much. It was Daniel who broke the silence. He had been sitting beside Alex, quiet and tense, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Daddy, are they both going to be okay?" Alex stopped pacing, turning to his son. The fear in Daniel's eyes was the same fear Alex was carrying in his own heart, but he couldn't show it. He had to be strong, for Daniel, for Selena, for Elise. "They're going to be okay," Alex said, his voice firm though his heart was trembling, "and they're both strong. They're going to get through this." But as the hours passed and the sky outside darkened, even Alex's confidence began to falter. The waiting stretched on endlessly, the uncertainty gnawing at him like a dark, relentless tide. He couldn't bear the thought of losing either of them. He couldn't bear the idea of walking out of this hospital without his family whole. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. A doctor stepped in, his face tired but calm. "Mr. Alex?" Alex leapt to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. "How are they? Are they?" The doctor smiled gently, a small but reassuring smile. "The surgeries were successful. Both your wife and your daughter are stable. Selena's liver donation was successful, and Elise's body is responding well to the transplant." The relief hit Alex like a wave, his knees buckling as he collapsed into the chair behind him. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Thank God. They'll both need time to recover," the doctor continued, "but we're optimistic." Alex nodded, unable to speak as the tears flowed freely down his face. The days after the surgery felt like a blur, a quiet haze of beeping monitors, whispered voices, and the sterile smell of antiseptic that lingered in the air. Alex sat by Elise's bed, his hand gently resting on hers, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep, but unwilling to close. He couldn't take his eyes off her, as if the simple act of looking away might change the fragile outcome they had been granted. Elise lay there, small and pale, her body weakened from the ordeal. Her chest rose and fell steadily, but it was slower than before, her strength still recovering from the surgery. Alex watched every breath she took, each one a reminder that she had survived. But the road ahead would be long, longer than any of them had hoped. In the next room, Selena was recovering too. Alex hadn't been able to see her yet, but the nurses assured him that she was stable. He held on to their words like a lifeline. Selena had always been strong, but knowing she had risked everything for Elise left Alex's heart both full and aching at the same time. He didn't know how to thank her. How could you ever express the depth of gratitude for a sacrifice like that? As the days passed, Elise's recovery was slow but steady. She began to wake up more, her eyes fluttering open for brief moments before drifting back to sleep. Each time she opened her eyes, Alex was there, offering her a soft smile, brushing the hair away from her face. She was still too weak to speak much, but the flicker of recognition in her eyes was enough. She was still their Elise, still the quiet, gentle soul she had always been. Daniel, too, rarely left his sister's side. He had always been her protector, but now his presence seemed to carry a weight beyond his years. He would sit on the edge of her bed, talking to her in soft whispers about school, about the drawings she'd left unfinished at home, and about how they would all be okay. It was a promise that, despite his young age, he seemed determined to keep. "Elise," he whispered one afternoon as she dozed lightly, "I'm saving a spot for your new drawing. You promised me another one, remember?" Elise's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze soft but focused on her brother. Her lips curled into the faintest of smiles, and though she didn't say anything, Daniel knew. She hadn't lost the part of her that saw the world through colors and lines, the part of her that expressed what words couldn't, and that gave him hope. Weeks turned into months, and Elise's recovery slowly gained momentum. It wasn't quick, and there were days when Alex and Selena both wondered how much more their daughter would have to endure. But with each step, no matter how small, she grew stronger. One afternoon, as the winter sun cast a soft glow through the hospital window, Elise sat up in bed, her sketchpad resting on her lap. Daniel sat beside her, eagerly watching as she began to draw. Her hand moved slowly, the lines shakier than they used to be. But they were there, deliberate, purposeful. She was finding her way back. Alex, watching from the doorway, felt an overwhelming sense of pride. His daughter, who had been through so much, was beginning to create again. The talent she held, the quiet brilliance that emerged through her art, was returning piece by piece. Every stroke of the pencil felt like a small victory, a reminder that Elise was still fighting, still pushing through. Selena, now well enough to visit, stood beside Alex, her hand resting gently on his arm. "She's doing it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She's really doing it." Alex nodded, unable to speak for fear that his voice might betray the tears threatening to spill over. It was a quiet moment, but one filled with more hope than they had felt in months. As Elise recovered, so did the rhythm of the family's life. Slowly, the hospital visits grew less frequent, and soon they were able to bring her home. The house, once filled with the uncertainty and tension of waiting, began to feel lighter. Elise's health improved, and with it, her confidence grew. Her art, which had always been her voice, became a source of joy and comfort for everyone in the family. The drawings that once seemed hesitant and unsure blossomed into vibrant, expressive pieces that filled their home with color and warmth. Daniel continued to be her greatest supporter. Though he had always protected her, now he became her biggest fan, hanging her artwork proudly in his room and showing it to anyone who would listen. "My sister," he would say with a grin, "is an artist." Elise's talent didn't go unnoticed. As her confidence grew, so did the complexity of her work. Though her intellectual development remained slower than her peers, the depth of her creativity more than compensated. She had a way of seeing the world that others couldn't, and it shone through in everything she drew. Life, after all the uncertainty, began to find its rhythm again. There were still challenges, of course. Elise's health needed constant monitoring, and there were days when her energy waned. But the family had learned to live with the balance of fragility and strength. Each day felt like a gift, and with it, a new sense of purpose. Selena and Alex, having weathered more storms than they ever imagined, found themselves more connected than ever. Their love, forged in sacrifice and strengthened by the trials they had faced together, had deepened in ways neither of them could have anticipated. They had faced loss, fear, and the darkest of uncertainties. And yet, here they stood, stronger, more resilient, and filled with a new appreciation for the life they had built. In the quiet moments when the house was still and the day's chaos had settled, Alex would often sit with Selena, their hands intertwined, simply breathing in the peace they had fought so hard to attain. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. And in those moments they knew they had endured, they had survived together. In the end, their family was bound not by the absence of hardship, but by the strength they found within it. Elise continued to draw, Daniel continued to protect, and Selena and Alex, always standing beside their children, held on to the belief that love, no matter how tested, would always carry them through.